Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. On today's video, what I want to discuss is a topic around loving ourselves. This is a question I got from a viewer recently. Rob asks this. He asks, can you do a video on if there is no self, how can there be self-love? Sometimes I feel like Buddhism asks me to choose between disregarding myself and taking care of myself. How does Buddhism align with modern wellness? Now, just to be clear, I love any questions you have for me. Please always feel free to put them down below in the notes. If I've done a separate video on it, I'll let you know. Otherwise, I'm happy to do a new one if I can, if I have an answer. So, in any event, what Rob is asking about, if there is no self, how is there self-love in Buddhism? And this was a response to an earlier video I did about if there is no self in Buddhism, how are we reborn, basically? How does rebirth work? And just like we might be confused in Buddhism, if we're trying to reconcile our thought that Buddhism talks about no self at all with a traditional notion of rebirth, so too we might be concerned in this case having to do with the issue of self-love. Now, on the question of traditional rebirth, I did a separate video on that, as I say, so I'll leave links to that down below in the notes. In any event, this is a subtle issue in early Buddhism. The idea of self-love has both good and bad connotations. And so what I want to do in today's video is to look at a couple of early suttas as well as a work of later Buddhist exegesis in order to give a flavor of the sort of the concerns with this as well as what the Buddha might have said. Now, I want to make clear, though, at the beginning that this question is based on this issue about no self in Buddhism. Did the Buddha actually teach that there was literally no self at all? And I've done videos on this topic. I'll leave links to those below. But in a nutshell, I don't think that that is an accurate way to describe early Buddhist Dharma. The Buddha never claimed that there was literally no self at all. Rather, the Buddha's claim was more subtle than that there really wasn't a permanent, essential core to our being that we could rely upon and that was the sort of the source of all of our beliefs and actions and so forth, or that was the source of our knowledge of the world or whatever it might be. So that at the core of our being was all change all the time. That was the essence of the Buddha's message. So there is an ordinary, normal conception of self that we live with every day and that the Buddha had no particular issues with saying was as real as anything else around here, as real as chariots and houses and so on. Nevertheless, although this was a conventional kind of self, there were problems with it. Problems that we learned to investigate through wisdom, through insight, through meditation, and so on. For example, we can become very attached to this conventional notion of self. And this attachment can lead to greed, can lead to egoism, can lead to conceit. I think we all know the kind of person who we're talking about here, the very famous statement that's attributed to the millionaire Malcolm Forbes, "He who dies with the most toys wins." This idea that, the whole point of life is to accumulate as much as possible, to sort of increase ourselves through our ownership of things. Ownership really being a legal way of sort of increasing what we consider us and ours. That's all part of this kind of egoism that can befall us if we become too attached to this ordinary, conventional kind of conception of self. Or it can lead to forms of conceit, thinking that we're better than other people because of our abilities, because of our knowledge, because of our past history, our parents, because of how much we own, various kinds of things. And that can lead to our harming others because we feel that they're inferior to us. And so we can see that this kind of self-love can actually be harmful. It can be harmful to others around us, and eventually it can even be harmful to ourselves. So that's where we sort of seem to end up with, is that we're left with a form of what seems to be self-love here, all involved in egoism and clinging and grasping and conceit, which is actually harmful. But is that the reality of self-love? We're going to get back to that in a bit. When the great 5th century Buddhist scholar and practitioner Buddhaghosa wrote his magnum opus, the Visuddhimagga, this is, again, 1,000 years after the Buddha's lifetime, he began his discussion of the practice of loving kindness, what's called metta in Pali. He began his discussion of the practice of loving kindness by talking about generating or noticing love for ourselves. He began it that way. However, when he did this, he noted that this seems not to have been the way that the Buddha himself discussed metta or loving kindness. The Buddha did not begin his discussion of loving kindness through loving ourselves. And so Buddhaghosa asks, does this not conflict with what is said in the texts? That is to say, does Buddhaghosa's strategy for loving kindness, doesn't it conflict with what the Buddha said? And what Buddhaghosa says is, no, it doesn't conflict, because the Buddha was talking about a practice that's supposed to lead, he says, to jhana, to jhanic meditation, to deep states of meditative absorption. Whereas Buddhaghosa claims that this kind of self-love, this metta directed towards oneself, is not supposed to lead directly into jhana, into deep states of absorption, but rather to be a way to generate the feeling in us of love, of loving kindness, that we can then aim towards others, right? And so we can use this generation of self-love directed at ourselves as a way to find that love somewhere that we can then direct to various people and beings and so on. And Buddhaghosa essentially claims that this follows the Buddha's own teaching because the Buddha speaks in a similar kind of way in a very famous early sutta called the Mallikā Sutta. And in that sutta, the Buddha says this. He says, having explored every quarter with the mind, one finds no one dearer than oneself. Likewise for others, each holds themselves dear. So one who loves themselves would harm no other. So essentially what Buddhaghosa is doing here is accepting what he sees as the Buddha's thesis that self-love is sort of basic and automatic, that all of us love ourselves most of all, that that's the sort of bedrock of our being, our bedrock of our motivation and justification for everything in life. I did actually a video on this passage, on this sutta, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes in case you want to hear more about that. However, another early text goes into more detail about what a real practice of loving ourselves might look like. In this other text, we have a King Pasenadi, a powerful king at the time, and somebody who used to talk with the Buddha frequently. And King Pasenadi says that he once went on a long retreat. Perhaps he was spending time meditating, as people did at the time. And what King Pasenadi says is that he had a thought that seemed to keep coming up in his mind while he was on this retreat. What he says is this: who are those who love themselves? And who are those who don't love themselves? And King Pasenadi says that meditating on this or thinking about it, it came to his mind that people who do bad things by body, speech, and mind are people who really don't love themselves. That is to say, people who do bad things by their body, they're injuring other people or stealing things, whatever it might be, by speech, saying things that are not nice to other people, or backbiting or whatever it might be, and even by mind, in other words, thinking unpleasant or unkind thoughts about others. They're treating themselves, King Pasenadi says, they're treating themselves like their own enemy. Whereas somebody who does kind things, good things by body, speech, and mind, is treating themselves like a loved one, like somebody who loves them would. Now, some of us may wonder how and why this might be the case. Why is it that acting badly by body, speech, and mind is treating ourselves like an enemy, and the reverse? And in response to this, the Buddha states a verse. Basically, the Buddha asks or says that there are certain things that we keep with us. The Buddha says this: "Both the good and the bad that a mortal does in this life is what they can call their own. That's what they take when they go. That's what goes with them like a shadow that never leaves." In other words, the Buddha is talking about a traditional view of the actions that we take in this life are by body, speech, and mind, giving us a better rebirth. But it's also true to an extent that acting well by body, speech, and mind can give us a better life right here and right now. It doesn't guarantee, of course, anything, but it gives us the greater chance for a better life, a better future. In other words, how we act, speak, and think now affects our future for either good or ill, depending on the character of those actions, but depending on the character of our intentions. So there are two basically allied approaches in early Buddhism. One was the lay path of practice, of beneficial good actions leading to beneficial results. And the other was the higher path, the path that was mostly undertaken by monastics, that was world transcending, that would lead to eventual awakening, enlightenment, and the end of dukkha. However, these paths merge in the sense that the lay path merges into the other path, and both paths are consistent with one another. We have to behave well in order to be on both paths. So self-love is a key part of the lay path of practice. Indeed, good conduct, good actions in body, speech, and mind just are loving ourselves. It's setting ourselves up for a better future, just the way a good friend would do for us if they loved us. Now, at the beginning here, Rob had asked about this issue of no self and self-love, and whether the idea of no self involves sort of disregarding ourselves in some respect. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. The whole point of Buddhist practice is to have a very deep regard for ourselves. And the proper way to do that is to understand what is the proper way to see ourselves and what is the improper way. The improper way is through greed, is through conceit, is through these kinds of practices or behaviors that harm ourselves and harm others. The proper way to keep ourselves in mind is to pursue beneficial practices for making ourselves better people. Indeed, at the end of his life, the Buddha implored some of his followers to, as he says, it's sometimes translated, be islands unto yourselves. In other words, what did he mean by that? What did he mean by be islands unto yourselves? He was actually asked this question, and basically what he said is, pursue right practice. To be an island unto yourself, to keep yourself as the island, is to keep the Dharma as your island as well, to keep practice as your island, by which he meant to keep the practices of meditation, the Eightfold Path. In particular, what he mentioned was the foundations of mindfulness, to keep practicing mindfulness. And in that way, we can be truly acting out of self-love. Now, I did a separate series of videos on these 4 foundations of mindfulness, and if you're not familiar with them or want a refresher, I'll leave a link to that playlist up here on the screen. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for all of your interest. If you're interested in supporting the channel, take a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below in the notes. And we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.